For the Western mind, Eastern religion can be obscure and hard to comprehend. When it comes to the Western mind, religion is much more hard and fast and has these sharp lines of distinction. In Eastern religions, there's much more of this syncretizing and this mutual commentary that happens among different ideologies and religious practices. In approaching Shintoism, the same can be said. Where does Buddhism begin and where does Shintoism end can be a frustrating subject to investigate. However, many Westerners are going to be more familiar with Shintoism than they might assume. By virtue of globalization, even just a tacit interest viewership of anime or Eastern film, they've already been introduced to several elements or motifs or yokai from the Shinto tradition. Our approach in this session, as it always has been when it comes to focus subjects on specific traditions, is that we will go through a loose history. We will give the philosophy, the spiritual tenets, creation story, speak on spirits, the unique things that make Shintoism Shintoism in comparison to other Eastern religions or other Western religions for that matter. What also always needs to be prefaced is that I am not from this culture. I am researching this as an outsider. And while I can bring a level of expertise by virtue of comparative mythology, my pronunciations will very likely not be proper. In which case, I hope commenters will help fill in the gaps of what I can't speak rightly to. But that's it for the hedging. We begin by actually looking at genetics. Amidst the last ice age, Japan, along with the Philippines and Indonesia, had land bridges or ice bridges in the glacial maximums that connected these otherwise separated land masses. Scholars say by this means, roughly 35,000 years ago, we have the first migration into Japan. The second migration happens around 15,000 years ago and is constituted by the Ainu, who are coming from Siberia. Now, the Ainu have a completely different language and a completely different ancestry. So right away, we're establishing that there are two very different types of groups, both inhabiting the same area that we would now refer to as Japan. And then lastly, around 500 BC, that brings a whole different sort of culture, most notably agriculture. This is a very rough summary overview of this history. It's still developing academically. The history is still being unraveled in this way, and there's a lot to mention in that big summary that I gave. But for our purposes, this is just to say that there are three distinctive groups that are bringing in what will eventually constitute what we call Shintoism. And it's not coming from solely one people. The spiritual tenets, spiritual philosophies that will eventually come to bear are contributed in a very messy way by these various groups. The Ainu's contribution is potentially the most contentious because the Ainu have been understood as the odd man out in this equation. They've been pushed north throughout time. They've gone through forced assimilation. And so I think it's appropriate before we really dive into the body of Shintoism that we acknowledge a very brief summary of Ainu spirituality. Making generalizations about the religion is very tricky because this is not a uniform group of people. There are many different groups of this people. And so these generalizations are just that, generalizations, in the same way as if you were to look at all of the Aboriginals of Australia, if you were to look at all of the Native Americans in America and make these very wide approaches to understanding their collective spirituality, even though each deserves its own individuated nuance. With that said, we did spend some time with the Ainu in the Siberian shamanism session a long time ago. By that relation with Siberia, there are several tropes that are uniform in their religious practices. The worship of the bear as an embodiment of the deity, a shamanistic, animistic worldview that we all share into our deep history. Beliefs such as when you dream, your soul leaves your body and wanders to places it's never been. The shaman has a unique gift for contacting these wandering spirits, these wandering souls, these ancestors. Their role is in service to the people, and the will of the people is to keep the balance with nature and to keep the balance with the world. When there is hurt, it needs to be honored. When somebody is mistreated, there will be a punishment. There are curses and there are ill-fated spirits that come from this, and they need to be either placated and treated, or they need to be prevented, and thus you have very elaborate funeral rites to ensure that the person who's passing can let go, and their letting go will ensure that the community will not suffer this continuous recursion, this generational trauma, so to speak. These unsettled spirits will become very topical when we are later discussing the yokai. Discussing deities in an animistic worldview is always a bit of a curious prospect, because if divinity and the sacred is everywhere and everything is a conscious wielding being, then divinity takes on a very different shape than it does in conventional institutional religion. So for the Ainu, the instance of the bear, as mentioned before, the bear is the embodiment of the mountain deity. The mountain deity takes on this body to gift the people with meat and fur. The deity is continuously reoccurring in this world, is an eternal essence. In a likened sort of way, we could look at the Apis bull and what that was for the Egyptians. The creator god is reoccurringly putting itself into the body of a bull. And in this case, with the Ainu, it is reoccurringly appearing in the bear. And this could be quite telling for us if we ever get to a session on the bear cults as they were in Europe. For the Ainu, these deities are referred to as kamoi, and that sounds very much like kami, again relevant later. Variant deities can manifest in the fox or owls or seals or land, sky creatures. They embody all manner of life. But of course, a more familiar form of deity is also known, the deity of fire, a goddess of fire, which that very much goes to Siberia, the goddess of fire, the goddess of sun and moon. Some regions they are distinctive, god of sun and god of moon, but in others, both. Goddess of sun and moon, dragon deity in the sky, the deity of the house, the deity of the altar, the deity of the woods, and the deity of water. If you notice, these are all very observable things. Where the projection of deity is applied is to things that can be witnessed with immediacy. Their effect on the world is witnessed firsthand, and thus the deification of those things is given because it can be witnessed firsthand. In this frame of mind, you can see that the attentiveness to all of the things in your world, all of the things that you experience, the sun, the moon, the fields, the plants, the animals, the sacredness of all of these things and all of their individual characteristics in such is important to the culture, is important that you pay attention to, that you acknowledge, that you respect, and that you keep the balance in this. And so this is where we introduce just plainly talking about Shintoism. The most capturing statement to the central tenet of Shintoism is the worship of kami. So the issue here then is how to define or how to understand kami. And kami is translated as God or Lord, but kami is also in regards to the forces of nature, light, darkness, the natural phenomena, spiritual phenomena, mythological phenomena, divinities, deities, all of this is kami. So perhaps a much better translation in our language than God or Lord would be simply spirit, as a animistic understanding of spirit. It is in everything. If it can be revered, if it can be respected, if it can be viewed to be bearing power in some way, or consciousness, or agency, it is kami. You can already get the hints of why this gets frustrating for the hard-nosed way of thinking of religion. Shintoism is particularistic. How people go about it is not enforced. The ways that people worship is informed by family, by tradition, and by area. So this is much more including of what formerly in the course is referred to as a religion loci. This is not a religion created for purposes of exporting. This is very individual. We can call the whole grab bag Shintoism, but still already we're seeing that the individual family practices, the individual ways of worship might have some uniformity naturally and organically, but they are not made to be uniform by an exterior power, by an exterior force. Any cohesion that comes about happens in an authentic and genuine way. So perhaps another very appropriate word for classifying Shintoism is that it's very plural. In this plurality, there are some uniform tenets that arise. The aforementioned worship of kami is uniform, that presence of kami in all things. There's also this philosophical tenet, this philosophical stance that the human being needs to strive toward purity. Impurity comes from the weight of the world, and we must do what we can to be cleansed of that through ceremony and through ritual to maintain ourselves and to maintain the way. And then, of course, in its functions, in what you do in this religion, is you visit shrines. You go through rituals of purification. You give prayers. You give offerings to things. And another kind of taboo or belief in this is that funerals don't take place at the shrines. That is distinct from many other religions. Death is understood to be impure. So in that way, it's taken elsewhere. There is a great ritual of purification. The Great Purification is its translation. This court ritual. This was a significant public event in the past and has become more and more private as time has gone on. There is somewhat of a distinctive change in interpretation of kami as the empire becomes predominant in Japan. All of a sudden, throughout time, of course, gradually, there is this more moral constitution to the kami. If humans do this specific thing, they will fall out of favor with them. They will judge what humans are doing as wrong. If we pollute that stream will want to pollute us, you see. The kami are observant of our actions and attitudes and where we're putting our efforts toward. From their post, they are morally correct. If they are ill-suited towards humanity, it's because it's naturally so. Again, the example of the stream. Is it wrong for the stream to feel wronged by humanity if it was poisoned by the efforts of humanity? This moral attitude is just. And so all of the things, all of the animism, all of the spirit inhabiting the world has a sense of moral rightness in where it stands and its attitude towards other things. This is not an unjust scheme. Since we acknowledge that we are subsumed, surrounded on all ends by this mysterious ineffability, the agency of it all transcends our comprehension. We then, humbly speaking, want to harmonize with all that this is. This is musubi, this harmonizing power. And if we follow the way, if we can find that mysterious way to harmonize and to be one with where we should genuinely be aligned in, this is Makoto. The truthful way. We don't want to cause any trouble. We want to live in the most ideal way possible. And so we honor, are considerate of all of that of which surrounds us. That the river wants to be this way, that the tree wants to be this way, that that animal wants to be that way. Honoring all these things and honoring ourselves, that this is the best of all possibilities, this truthful way. All the deities get along with each other in this. Everything gets along with each other just fine. Why would we not also want to get along as everything else does? The deer don't wage war on the bear because the bear preys on them. It seems there is an innate understanding. There is an innate harmony between what would otherwise be interpreted as conflicting kami. But I want to take some time to sit in this a bit, this pursuit of truth. Because in this context, the truth is showing itself to you in all directions. The wisdom of the universe is apparent to our eyes. It's no accident that in ancient Japanese poetry, there is so much attention paid to the mutuality between the poet and nature. The processes of nature as they mirror the processes of the internal landscape of human beings. This is a very poetic, let's just say, spirituality. The truth is showing itself in an infinite amount of forms in all directions. If you're looking for an answer, it will make itself apparent to you. If you seek it truthfully, then the truth will be shown to you. And so this earnestness of seeking authenticity in your development is reciprocated by the greater world, and that is the harmonizing power. If you lean into it in the same way everything else leans into it, this is how it goes. And so no wonder Shintoism prizes a heart of truth, or a true heart. No wonder it prizes remaining pure in this way, pure as in following the way. Impurity would seek to take you off of that harmony, to put disharmony into you. So we must maintain this. The best way to save this world and to save yourself, to preserve it all, to go with it all, is to seek a true heart and a bright and clear mind. So, if this is the seeking, then it's no wonder that there is some degree of confusion and inconsistency about the stories and the lore of it. Its particularistic nature, its plural nature, would certainly exacerbate this, you see. There is no holy deity in the sense that we recognize it. There is no sacred scripture in the way that we recognize it. There are no founding figures, no central doctrine. A translation of what Shinto means is the way of the gods. And given our context, you can see how we can interpret that much differently than we otherwise would if I had started with a statement like that. Throughout this, you might be thinking, well, that sounds a lot like Taoism, or that sounds a lot like Buddhism. And the answer is yes, it does. Buddhism will naturally be complementive of Shintoism. This spread of Buddhism is a very different story than the Christianization of Europe, and will merit its own session in the future. Roughly 300 years after the introduction of Buddhism into Japan, we get the writing down of two central texts, and that go through the practices, the ceremonies, the stories of the deities, so forth. I will be linking both of these in the description for those that are curious. Now that we have the philosophy and the tenets and context, we're going to be moving through the mythology in a quick fashion to contrast, to compare what we can in the way of comparative mythology. The cosmogony begins with chaos, or a great silence. Sound starts to stir, and light particles start to appear. Those light particles rise and collect, and the darker particles descend and collect, and this inhabits this earth-sky egg. And in this upper part, this heavens that is created, comes the first deity. This deity is genderless, androgynous, and embodies the source of the universe. The introduction of the firstborn here is quite curious because there is no indications that this firstborn deity, this source of all, has ever been revered. And so the inclusion of this one above all is quite the head scratcher for academics and those that study Shintoism in depth. Certain scholars have tied this initiating deity to Tengaloa for the Polynesians, or to Tengri for the Turkic and Mongolian mythology. Regardless, just after this initiating firstborn, we get the introduction of two more deities that are not coupled. The first one that embodies masculinity and the first one that embodies femininity. And this is the trifecta, or in Kabbalism, the supernull triangle. This is a very common trope for creation stories. Each are unique in their own way. For instance, if we had the example of Sumeria and Babylon of Absu, Namu, and Mamu, then you could say that Mamu comes last and is the firstborn of the initiating pair. Here we're seeing the reverse. Oddly, this mirrors Gnostic cosmology quite well. To stay on point, in this Shinto cosmogony, there are now three, and these three bring about more deities, and these more deities bring about sibling pairs, couples. All of these ensuing primordial deities will completely disappear. They will not be mentioned again. Their functions are questionable and obscure. For the Mesopotamians, it was the same way. And if we were the Greeks, then we would have these deities stick around and ultimately be put down in a war of the Titans. Here, though, they're just gone. But the last of them to be born will become the most consequential, Izanagi and Izanami. They are gifted this mythical spear and descend into a bridge that brings them to Earth. This trope has a likeness to the Earth Diver myth and also the Sky Chain. Both of these tropes tie them not only to Eurasia and into Eastern Europe, but also topically ties to creation stories and mythology in Native America. But let's focus and stay on point for a while here. They aim to bring stability to this otherwise drifting land. The world is very primordial, miasmic, and it needs some degree of solidity. And so the first island is brought up. Now that that is done, they happen across a pillar and they start to initiate the first copulation. They circle each other around this pillar until they meet. She speaks first and then they copulate. The births given thereafter are deformed. So that's an interesting device, the introduction of deformities. And they retrace their steps. They go back, they circle the pillar again, and now he speaks first, and then the children are what they expected them to be. However, the very last child is the kami of fire. This kami of fire burns the mother, and she dies. She is cast into the land of Yomi, which is the underworld, and Izanagi is furious and slays the kami of fire. And from that blood, from this death, per se, the 8 martial kami are formed. The 8 kami of the mountain. And Izanagi goes to the underworld to retrieve Izanami. He goes, he finds her. She says, "Don't look at me." He looks, and she curses him. And as he's running away, she's yelling at him, "I will kill 1,000 people a day." And he retorts, "I will ensure that 1,500 are born." When Izanagi returns safely, he cleanses himself. When he washes his left and right eye, the sun and moon kamis are born. When he washes his nose, the kami of storms is born. Okay, this is where we stop for now. There's a lot to go over. The pillar that they circled for the first copulation is the axis mundi. That is the holy mountain. That is the pillar of sky, the pillar to the heavens. The act of slaying the fire kami and it creating other kamis, and the act of him cleansing himself and the sun and the moon coming from this cleansing and the god of storms, this is very much in the vein of the dismemberment myth or the trope of creating deities incidentally from either the death of deities or a part of deities. This is the rebirth of Dionysus via Zeus's thigh. These kamis of the sun and moon being eyes is very evocative of Egypt, the Eye of Horus. It's not just that, it's the ancient belief that the sun and moon were different eyes of the deity looking over the world. This is a fertility deity reference. The moon, when it takes over the podium of the seasons, kills the fertility of the land. But it comes back. It returns under the tutelage of the sun. If you know your deconstruction of the miracles of Jesus, then this one rings really close to home. Izanami remains in the underworld, and from there creates a great number of other kami. So we should note that Izanami is functioning as an underworld goddess like Nyx or like Ereshkigal. And from her comes Raijin and Fujin. These are more recognizable deities, especially for those that play Mortal Kombat, for instance. These are weather deities. Raijin of thunder, lightning, and storms, and Fujin of the wind. They take the form of Onis, again, because of the underworld association. The fingers are quite symbolic. Raijin has 3 fingers that represent past, present, and future. This is very evocative of the fates. And then Fujin has 4 fingers, and this represents the cardinal directions. Raijin wields a hammer and plays the drums. This is very evocative of the thunder deity. And Fujin carries a bag of winds that stir up storms. This bag of winds can be seen in the Odyssey. So the number of references that you can find to other mythologies within the mythology of Shintoism, if you know how to look, are greater than perhaps any other. The different migrations that substantiated the body of Shintoism, most notably via the Ainu as well, the inspirations from the Ainu connecting to the stories that would substantiate Native American mythos, spiritual religious practice, and then all the other migrations that brought the inspirations that would call to Eurasia, would call to the West, and would disseminate all the way well into the Sumerian, the Egyptian, the Greek, the Celtic, the Finnish, so on and so on and so on. You can find all of these tropes somewhere within these myths. And notice how I told the narrative. Obviously, I didn't tell the whole narrative, but this was a narrative. The creation of the deities leading to the initial 2 that led to the Orpheus story of going into the underworld. The Polynesians also had this story. Mind you, it ended differently. But it is this open question of where did these tropes originate from? How did all of these cultures get them? And that can't be answered by virtue of the historical record. But it is within reason to say that Shinto mythology uniquely is a nexus point between what would later be called the new and the old worlds. They have the mutual inspiration of both within their mythos. It should also be noted that these deities that I've listed, the list goes well on, and the list eventually substantiates different clans and different rulers. So this direct delineation from the story of the gods into the ancestry of man. So the separation between deity and mankind, or between kami as deity and kami as spirit, is all very blurry, indistinguished. So when we say kami and when we say kami, there isn't really much to be said in the way of distinguishing in comparison to, say, how the West would come to understand this line of distinction, the difference between mankind and divinity. But we have one more complicated subject to explore, and that is the yokai. How to distinguish the kami from the yokai, simply speaking, is that the yokai are not worshipped and kami are worshipped. So you can say that yokai are simply unworshipped kami. They tend to embody fears of the unknown. They tend to embody other, let's just say, wayward spirits or mysteries. The conversation of kami also gets more messy, because then we can start to include the kami that were brought in or inspired from Taoism or inspired from Buddhism. So the distinguishing lines of which kami belong to which exact tradition is discernible, but for our purposes, we're just exploring the lot to kind of get the gist and get a greater familiarization. Such is the whole purpose of this session. The yokai can be found just about anywhere. There are certain ones that would manifest in the possessions of people, certain ones of the mountains, certain ones at crossroads, at bridges, at the edge of water. This is a truly vast category. But one that we're already somewhat familiar with are the oni, and the oni is a reference to that underworld, and this is the red-skinned beast of fiery temperament, the chaotic and destructive aspects of the world, mankind's most primal dark impulses, violent impulses are symbolized, embodied by the iconography of the oni. These can be understood as demons or ogres. They're not necessarily evil, though, such as apparent when we gave the overall characteristic of Shintoism earlier. Evil is not the same evil as we tend to have been indoctrinated into that idea. Oni can bring calamity and tragedy, thunderstorms, fires, all this. But if that is something that embodies our own beingness, a greater part of our own beingness, then that thing is not evil in the way that we might be used to thinking about it. We have our demons, and those demons have a role to play. Those demons can be beneficial in the process of overcoming or in the process of integrating. So accordingly, oni are not something to be genocided out of existence, but nonetheless, their function culturally is fairly apparent. On the New Year's Eve in North Japan, there's a ritual where they wear the masks of the oni to scare disobedient children. This is a very common trope of why cultures created monsters and cryptids and stories of these evil things in the past, was to actually protect children from the real dangers of the world. And then there are much more obscure yokai, like this umbrella with one eye that has a long tongue. This happens when somebody leaves an umbrella unused. It becomes this yokai. It delights in scaring people. Now, I'm not going to pretend I understand this. The one eye thing is a curious lead to go down. But there is a long withheld tradition of ascribing persona to possessions, household spirits. Such can be easily tied to Romanian mythology as well, where possessions take on a spirit unto themselves. So in that old way of thinking, this is not obscure. And then comes the universal feeling of the strange things that happen in the mountain, the inexplicable, odd phenomena that happens when one is alone in the mountains. And instead of keeping this an unknown, we have means to explain that phenomena of the mountain. And here it's a yokai called Tengu, depicted as a bird-like humanoid spirit. Tricksters associated with such, mischievous. If we were in Korea, we could call these the translation goblins, or if we were in the West, we could call these goblins. This trickster essence of the mountains in its ambience. And in the Tengu, we can see the curious case of how this changes. The idea of what this spirit is changes in time. The Buddhists feared this, to be tricked off the path. The Tengu would trick them off the path. Whereas more recently, they are understood as mountain guardians, Like the gods in mythology, they are subject to change. Next is the kitsune, which is this fox spirit that can take on human forms, the shape-shifting forms. They are associated with magic, intelligence, and trickery, and can be mischievous. Now, this is something that we've unpacked before in the course. The ancient practice in shamanism of skinwalking, of taking on the spirit of the animal and its characteristic forms. Accordingly, the fox has always been a revered spirit. The fox is sneaky. The fox can get by without being noticed. The fox can be on its own. This is an archetype. And so the fox being able to shapeshift and take on human forms is a nod all the way back to this practice in ancient shamanism. However, this kitsune is definitely depicted in a great number of animes. The first one that comes to mind is Inuyasha, and then another time in Yu Yu Hakusho. Next is the kappa, or the kappa, I'm not sure which, this water yokai. You might recognize right away this green humanoid creature with the shell looks an awful lot like a Koopa Troopa. Although in the mythology, they're frog-like and they have this hole in their head that needs to be filled with water. This is because they are a water spirit. They cannot live without the water. So the animals that come from the water need that water to stay alive. If you disturbed that water source, if you polluted it, then naturally these kappas would be against you. Next are the Yamauba. Again, not sure if I'm saying these right. This is depicted as an old woman that lives in the mountains. Wise old woman, has magical powers, sometimes thought to be cannibalistic, to lure people into their homes and feast on them. This is Baba Yaga. This is an archetype of the ancient world, the old crone, as she was charged with initiating the children into becoming adults. They would say the children would go into the old crone's hut and they would die. But what they don't mention is that they die because they come out men. So this is a deviation from that. This is an embodiment, the yokai of the old crone, and what can come of the crone as she removes herself from society and lives in the wild. That spirit that becomes of her is this Yamauba. Next are the Yuri, and this is very recognizable for those that know their modern horror. These are ghosts, simply. Completely universal in the ancient mythological past. That if something happens, if someone dies a tragic death and their death is not honored, is not quelled, is not placated with the proper ceremonies, they will become like this. They remain here because there is some unfinished business. You have old houses, you have old temples, you have old land. If this unfinished business can't go anywhere, it is trapped, then it will haunt whatever it can or whomever is connected to this initiating tragedy that kept them here. Next is the Omobozu, which is a sea monk, as the translation says. And this leads to a little bit of a theme that happens. The souls of monks running amok as yokai, which I think is an interesting investigation of its own. They say this is a drowned priest. The exact features of this yokai are not discernible. They tend to be inky black, like a shadow. The size of their form is variant. We might think of this as an explanation for why some ships just don't come home. intermixed with these anomalous sightings that happen off the coast when you're in the midst of an eternal sea by your eye. Staying with the theme of being potentially colossal, there is the Daidarabochi. These are giant, bald-headed priests. Again, priests. They form mountains with their movements. When they're resting, they are mistaken as mountains. They can pick up rocks and hurl them great distances. Earthquakes, landslides, an explanation for why the mountains look like they do. Certain legends explain features of the Japanese landscape and areas by the presence and the doings of the Daidarabochis. Mount Fuji is sometimes said to have been formed by such yokai. So there are many things happening here. For those that follow the course, you already can dig into this more. But obviously, the series Attack on Titan seems to have its inspiration here. And lastly, a mention of the Shinigami. And these are death spirits, plainly, connected to places where death occurs. This is harmful. They have been depicted many ways in anime and in film. However, these death spirits are simply that which is attracted to this death. This is haunting. The victims of them become obsessed with death. This is a suicidal ideation. Evil begets evil. So when they occur, there is much to do to prevent their presence. Spirits are not outside of you by the ancient conception. They are well within us. We are a constitution of spirits. So thus your thoughts are inhabiting spirits. And when your thoughts go to this subject of death, the thing that attracts death, that is given name here in Shinigami. This is like the Yuris in Greece, or the Furies. In certain creeds of shamanism, death spirits are believed to be the ancestors that will for us to join them in that realm. And life is the act of pushing off the will of these ancestors for us to join them. If we are living, we ought to stay. So the death spirits therein should be avoided by any means. So personifying, naming death spirits, giving them this kind of cultural identity is not necessarily unique. The iconography and what has been done with this idea is certainly unique, but the idea extends to all of our ancient ancestry, all of our ancient beliefs. That was just a quick list of the yokai. There is an extensive amount of them. I selected them based off of either recognition factor, and in which case shows how you have encountered Shintoism even in a wayward form, or how certain yokai hint at different mythological associations, mutual identity with other cultures. We have a number of things to acknowledge before we work into a conclusion. Within this, we've seen a number of acknowledgments to ancient shamanism. We've seen the Orphic egg. We've seen the earth diver myth. We've seen the dismemberment myth. There is such a host of similarities within the greater body of Shintoism that seems in thanks to the many migrations that constituted its ensuing mythos that we acknowledged in the beginning. Since Shintoism was never hard and fast, never took on those iron gates of religion that would be in vogue eventually in Europe, we have this openness to inspirations, to stories, to tropes, and that's why there is such a bounty here. How we can find threads that tie to the Native Americans, to Siberian shamanism, to the ancient Middle East, to Egypt, to Europe, so forth. We can find all of it here because this is a open spirituality. And it has retained threads from its initial inspirations well into this day. It survives, and we can observe it because it kept itself living. There is a great advantage to not pinning yourself down, to not shoving yourself into a clean category. Shintoism also survived because it co-integrated with Buddhism instead of warring with Buddhism. This difference in approach not only ensured its inspirations in the past, but also ensured its continuity into the present day. Distinguishing itself from the West, you can see how this difference in approach towards nature makes a big difference in the religion created. What I mean is Babylon, Sumer, and so forth would distinguish its relationship with nature as something to conquer, as something to overcome, whereas here the idea was to go with it. If we embrace it, if we understand it, if we maintain that balance, then that is utopia, that is the ideal. And that, as a bridge to the native philosophy as well, is seamless. So now we can answer to why Shintoism tends to be confusing to the Westerner. For one, there are so many inspirations in this. And that inclusion of all of these different aspects obviously can make it hard to comprehend, hard to deal with it all. And its religious or spiritual orientation, its approach, tends much more toward the poetic and shamanistic in comparison to the decided Western religions. This maintained fluidity and particularisticness of Shintoism is its great advantage. There is still so much to be inspired by and so much yet to learn, so much more wisdom to glean from Shintoism. So we will certainly be returning to it in variant forms in future sessions, but for now, that's where we'll leave it. The Spiritual Studies course is an effort towards free public education on matters of religion, spirituality, and comparative mythology. It seeks to offer this in an earnest and sober fashion. Supporting the course in the Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below supports this initiative. In tandem, members benefit from commentaries on each of these sessions, the number of things that couldn't make it into the session by virtue of what it takes to make this kind of a video, announcements of what is to come, what research is on the docket, and early access to these sessions. If you enjoyed this session, it's in thanks to Slow Leak, John Crestwell, Deborah Cano, Seder Witch, Kristen, Nora, The Irrational Sage, Scorson, Craig Mitchell, and quote, someone. Stay curious and keep wondering.